On December 11th, 1978, a Lufthansa cargo worker named Kerry Whalen sat alone in a break room at JFK Airport, eating a ham sandwich his wife had packed that morning. In less than 20 minutes, he would have a gun pressed to his temple, while 6 masked men executed the largest cash robbery in American history. And the truly disturbing part, of the dozen people who touched that $5, 875 million, all but one would end up dead. Kerry Whalen would be one of the lucky ones. And so Kerry Whalen, who was 45 years old with thick glasses and a receding hairline, he'd been working the graveyard shift at Lufthansa's cargo facility for 11 years. Every night at midnight, he'd kiss his wife Dorothy goodbye at their small house in Queens, and she'd hand him the same brown paper bag with a ham sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of black coffee. Kerry had 2 daughters, Linda, who was 19 and studying nursing, and Susan, who was 16 and still asked him to help with her math homework when he got home in the mornings. Now, the Lufthansa cargo building at JFK wasn't just any warehouse. This squat, unremarkable building processed millions in cash and jewelry every week, all flowing between American banks and European financial centers. Kerry knew this, naturally, because part of his job was signing for these shipments. But what Kerry didn't know was that for the past 6 months, one of his co-workers had been carefully documenting every detail of their security procedures. That co-worker was Louis Werner, and he was drowning in gambling debts. Werner was 46, divorced, and owed bookies connected to the Luxee's crime family more than $20,000, about $90,000 in today's money. He'd grown up in Astoria, Queens, the son of a mechanic, and he'd worked at Lufthansa even longer than Kerry, 15 years of watching millions pass through while he struggled to make his $2,025 weekly paycheck stretch. And so Werner had started taking mental notes. Which days saw the biggest shipments, how many guards worked each shift, where the alarm systems were located. But Werner wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was a desperate man who made one phone call to his bookie, Peter Gruenwald, and said something he couldn't take back. What if I could tell you about a score at JFK? A big one. Millions. Therefore, Gruenwald did what any connected guy would do. He kicked it up the chain. The information made its way to Jimmy Burke, a 6-foot-tall Irish-American associate of the Luchese family who ran a crew out of Robert's Lounge in Queens. Burke, who was 47 with silver hair and cold blue eyes, had been hijacking trucks since he was a teenager. But this was different. This was the kind of score that could set up him and his entire crew for life. And so on the night of December 10th, Kerry Whalen had no idea that Burke and 5 other men were sitting in a van outside the cargo facility, watching him through the window as he unwrapped a sandwich. At 3:00 a.m. On December 11th, Kerry heard the buzzer at the front door. This wasn't unusual. Drivers came and went at all hours. Through the security monitor, he saw what looked like a standard delivery van. But when he opened the door, something was immediately wrong. The man standing there wore a ski mask. And so Kerry tried to slam the door, but the masked man who we now know was Tommy DeSimone shoved a .45 caliber pistol into the gap. "Duck up," DeSimone said. "Back the fuck up and don't make a sound." Behind DeSimone, 5 more men poured out of the van, all wearing ski masks and carrying guns. They moved with military precision, which made sense because Jimmy Burke had rehearsed this with them for weeks at a warehouse in Brooklyn. The Lufthansa cargo facility had 7 employees working that night. Within 4 minutes, Burke's crew had rounded up all of them, forcing them to lie face down on the cold concrete floor of the lunchroom. Kerry Whalen found himself next to Rudy Eric, the night supervisor, who was whispering prayers in German. But the robbers knew exactly where they were going. While 4 men guarded the employees, 2 others headed straight for the high-value, room-vault-like space protected by a double-door system and multiple alarms. They knew that Louis Werner had disabled the silent alarm 3 days earlier during a maintenance check. They knew the exact weight limits for the pressure-sensitive floor. They even knew that the security cameras had blind spots Werner had carefully mapped. "Nobody has to die tonight," Burke told the employees, his Boston accent bleeding through despite his attempts to disguise his voice. We're here for the money, not for you. But if anyone tries to be a hero, everyone dies." "Understood." Kerry Whalen pressed his face against the floor and thought about Dorothy, probably asleep in her bed. He thought about Linda's nursing school tuition and Susan's math homework, and he stayed perfectly still. And so while Kerry and his co-workers lay on that freezing floor, Burke's crew went to work on the high-value room. They knew from Werner that December 11th would be special. A massive shipment of American currency heading to West Germany had arrived the previous day. But even Werner had underestimated. As they cut through the locks and stepped inside, they found themselves staring at neat stacks of $100 bills, piled higher than a man's waist. But that wasn't even the most valuable part. There were also boxes of gold jewelry, Swiss watches, and negotiable securities. One robber, later identified as Angelo Sape, actually laughed out loud when he opened a particular crate. Inside were dozens of velvet bags containing uncut diamonds destined for Frankfurt. What they discovered next changed everything about the heist. In a locked cage at the back of the room sat 40 cardboard boxes, each one containing $125,000 in neatly banded hundreds. This wasn't supposed to be. There it was, an unexpected German currency shipment that had arrived just 6 hours earlier. Instead of the $2 million score Werner had promised, they were looking at nearly $6 million in cash and valuables. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. As the crew loaded box after box into their van, one of them, most likely Tommy DeSimo, noticed something. Rudy Erich, the German supervisor, had lifted his head slightly and was looking directly at him. Their eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. But DeSimone had a reputation for paranoia and violence. He walked over and pressed his gun against Erich's temple. "You trying to remember my face?" DeSimone asked. Erich, who was 54 years old with a wife and 3 children in Forest Hills, immediately pressed his face back to the floor. "Neen, no, I see nothing," he whispered. Jimmy Burke intervened, pulling DeSimone away. They couldn't afford bodies, not here, not now. But Kerry Whalen, lying 3 feet away, had heard every word, and he understood something that made his blood run cold. These men were discussing whether to kill them all. Therefore, when the robbers finally left at 4:16 a.m., 64 minutes after they'd arrived, Kerry waited a full 10 minutes before moving. Even after they heard the van drive away, nobody wanted to be the first to lift their head. It was Rudy Erich who finally stood up, his face pale and his hand shaking as he reached for the phone. The FBI arrived within an hour, and the magnitude of what had happened became clear. At $5 at 1875 million, about $28 million today, it was the largest cash robbery in American history. Agent Steve Carbone, who would lead the investigation, stood in the ransacked high-value room and made a prediction that would prove tragically accurate. Whoever pulled this off is going to have a massive target on their back. This much money doesn't disappear quietly, and so naturally, the first person they looked at was the inside man. It didn't take long to identify Louis Werner's gambling debts were common knowledge among his co-workers, and he'd called in sick on the night of the robbery, the first time in 5 years. But despite all this evidence, Werner denied everything. And without any physical evidence linking him to the masked men, the FBI hit a wall. But as it would turn out, the real danger wasn't from the FBI. It was from Jimmy Burke himself. See, Burke had a problem. Too many people knew about the heist, and most of them were starting to spend money like idiots. Martin Krugman, the wig shop owner who'd helped plan the robbery, bought his wife a new Cadillac. Tommy DeSimone was seen at nightclubs throwing $100 bills around like confetti. These were men who'd never had money, and they didn't know how to hide it. And this is where the story reaches its most horrifying point. On December 18th, just 1 week after the heist, truck driver Parnell Stacks Edwards was found shot dead in his Queens apartment. Edwards had been supposed to destroy the van used in the robbery, but he'd gotten high and forgotten. The van was found by police with fingerprints inside. Therefore, Jimmy Burke made a decision that would turn the Lufthansa heist from a perfect crime into a bloodbath. Everyone who could connect him to the robbery had to go. Over the next 6 months, bodies started appearing across New York. Martin Crewman vanished on January 6, 1979. His body was never found. Tommy DeSimone disappeared on January 14th. Louis Cafora and his wife, Joanna, were shot in their car on March 13th. Joe Manry and Robert McMahon were found shot execution-style in a Buick on May 16th. Paulo Lee Castri's body was found on a smoldering trash heap in Brooklyn on June 13th. Each murder was more brutal than the last. When they found Richard Eaton's body in a trailer in Brooklyn, he'd been frozen solid, earning Jimmy Burke the nickname the Iceman. The FBI later determined that Eaton had been tortured for hours before he died, probably to find out where he'd hidden his share of the money. Cary Whalen read about each murder in the newspaper, his hand shaking as he recognized the descriptions. These weren't random mob hits. These were the voices he'd heard that night, the masked men who'd held guns to his head. In the end, only one person went to prison for the Lufthansa heist: Louis Werner, the inside man who'd started it all. He was convicted in May 1979 and sentenced to 15 years. He served 6 and never said a word about Jimmy Burke or the others. Jimmy Burke himself was eventually convicted on other charges and died in prison in 1996, taking the location of the money to his grave. Of the estimated $5, 875 million stolen, not a single dollar was ever recovered. The FBI spent over 30 zero-man hours on the case and came up empty. But for Cary Whalen, the horror never really ended. In 1985, he told his daughter Linda that he still had nightmares about that morning, about Tommy DeSimone's voice, asking if he was trying to remember faces. Cary died of a heart attack in 1993, and Dorothy said he never felt safe again after the heist. He'd spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if someone would come to tie up loose ends. Today, the Lufthansa cargo facility still operates at JFK, though with vastly improved security. And somewhere, in safety deposit boxes or buried in backyards across New York, $5.875 million in cash might still be waiting. Unless, of course, Jimmy Burke took that secret to his grave, too.